An old man stands on the deck of a wooden ship the size of a small village. He is 600 years old. His beard is white. His hands are cracked from 120 years of swinging an axe against trees nobody believed needed to be cut. For 120 years, his neighbors laughed at him. They watched him build a boat on dry land, miles from any sea, in a world that had never seen rain fall from the sky. They knocked on the wood. They knocked on the wood. They mocked the smell of pitch. They went on with their weddings and their harvests and their ordinary Tuesdays, certain that nothing was coming. You would have laughed too, if you're honest. Imagine a boat the size of a village, built by a man who talked about a flood nobody had ever seen, in a world where it had simply never rained before. The sound of that laughter echoed across a dusty plain, year after year. Decade after decade, that laughter continued while one old man kept swinging his axe anyway. He knew that something was coming. For 40 days, the sky did what it had never done before. It suddenly opened. Water fell until the highest mountain on earth was a memory under waves. Everyone who laughed is gone. Every wedding, every harvest, every ordinary Tuesday is gone. Noah stands on the deck looking at a horizon with no land. Try to imagine that view for a moment. There was water in every direction, no shoreline and no birdsong. There was nothing but the creak of timber and the breathing of animals below deck. And then one morning, the rain stops. The water begins to fall. A mountain peak breaks the surface. A bird returns with a leaf in its beak. Noah steps out onto wet, ruined ground. The only sound is the dripping of water off the ark's massive timber walls. He does not know yet that God is about to do something he has never done before and will never take back. You can imagine the silence in that moment. It is the kind of silence that follows a massive disaster. In that silence, survivors don't yet know if it is safe to feel relief. Noah builds an altar and offers a sacrifice. God, looking at the smoke rising from that altar, says 6 words that change the shape of human history. I will never do this again. He doesn't just say it, he seals it. He hangs a rainbow in the clouds, not as a pretty decoration, but as a legal sign. This promise is written across the sky, visible to every person alive. This is the first covenant in the Bible. If you only remember one thing about it, remember this. It cost something. It cost the entire world. It cost everyone Noah ever knew outside his own family. A covenant, you will learn very quickly in these next 25 minutes, is never free. Here is what most people miss about the word itself. In Hebrew, it is berith, and it does not mean what you think it means. It is not a handshake or a gentleman's agreement. The ancient phrase for making a covenant is karet berith, which means, literally, to cut a covenant. You do not sign it or speak it. You must cut it. In the ancient world, when 2 parties made a binding promise, they didn't shake hands. Instead, they cut an animal in 2, laid the pieces on the ground, and walked between them. The blood on the ground was the seal. The death of the animal stood in the place of the death that would come to whichever side broke the promise. Keep that image in your mind because you are going to need it during this journey. About 400 years after Noah steps off that ark, God finds a 75-year-old man in a city of moon worshippers. He tells him to leave everything he has ever known. Then that man asks God to prove his promise. When he asks for proof, something happens in that scene that almost no one can explain. It is so strange that for thousands of years, scholars have stopped on this passage and simply stared, unsure what to do with it. This man falls into a sleep so deep and terrifying that the Bible calls it a horror of great darkness. While he sleeps, something passes between the pieces of a sacrifice that he never sees with his own eyes. We are going to come back to that scene. Hold that thought because by the end of this video, that one strange detail is going to explain the entire cross. This is not a story about religious rules carved into stone. Those rules are not locked away in a museum. This is not a story about ancient rituals performed by men in robes who lived and died thousands of years ago. It is not about contracts or legal language meant to confuse you. This is a story about one promise, made again and again in blood across 2,000 years. It is a bond between the God of the universe and people who constantly kept breaking his heart time after time. By the time we reach the end, you will understand why a Jewish carpenter's son once lifted a cup of wine in an upper room in Jerusalem and used the exact same word that Noah, Abraham, and Moses used. That word is covenant. Let us start at the beginning with a man, a flood, and a promise written in the sky. Picture Noah for a moment. After the rainbow fades, he does not get to go home to the world he knew because there is no home left. There is only mud, silence, and the slow work of starting over with 8 people and 2 of every living creature. The flood is over, but the grief is not. You can lose an entire world and still have to wake up tomorrow. You might even have to plant a vineyard. If you have ever had to rebuild a normal life after something shattered it, you already understand more about Noah than most biblical commentaries will ever tell you. Noah had to bury the memory of every single neighbor who once laughed at him. He lived knowing he had warned them, and knowing the door of the ark had been opened right up until the exact moment it was finally shut. That is the part nobody tells you about Noah's covenant. It was not a celebration. It was a man learning to trust a God who had just shown him, up close, exactly how serious he is about sin and human rebellion. God showed how far he will go to start again with the people who are left. The rainbow was not a decoration. It was a reminder hung in the sky every time it rained, so that future generations would look up and remember. During a storm, they would remember that God keeps his word, even when it costs him something. And this is where it gets truly remarkable. 400 years pass after this moment in human history. A man named Abram, who is not yet Abraham or the father of nations, is living comfortably in Ur of the Chaldeans. This was a city built around the worship of the moon. He has a wife, and he has great wealth. However, Abram has no children. In his ancient world, that absence is its own kind of deep grief. It is the kind of sorrow that follows a man into every quiet room of his house. And then God suddenly speaks to him. God tells him to leave his country, his family, and everything he has ever called home. He must go to a land that God will show him. God promises to make him into a great nation, and so Abram completely packs up and leaves. You can imagine what that massive decision cost him. Think of every friend who thought he had lost his mind. Think of every relative who watched him walk away from a comfortable life toward a horizon with only a promise. Stay with me here, because this is where the story turns incredibly strange. Years later, Abram is old. He still has no son of his own, and he still has no land to call his home. He is left waiting in the darkness. He finally asks God the question every one of us is asked in the dark. How can I know this is real? How can I know you will actually do what you said? It is a question you have probably asked too during your own waiting. You might lie awake at night, wondering if the promise you are holding onto is real, or if it is just something you made up to survive a hard season. God's answer to Abram is not a speech. Instead, it is a ceremony. He tells Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abram cuts the larger animals in half and lays the pieces across from each other on the ground, just as two ancient kings would seal a treaty. The smell of blood and dust hung in the evening air as Abram worked. His hands did the strange, heavy labor of a ceremony he didn't fully understand yet. This is karet berith, which means cutting a covenant. Normally, both parties would walk together between the pieces, smeared in blood. They bound themselves to the agreement on pain of becoming like the split animals if they broke it. But that is not what happens here. As the sun sets, a deep sleep falls on Abram. The Bible does not call it ordinary sleep. It calls it a horror of great darkness, which is a terror so heavy it completely presses him down into deep unconsciousness. While he sleeps, utterly unable to participate, a smoking firepot and a blazing torch appear and pass between the pieces alone. Hold that image in your mind. We are definitely not done with it yet, not even close. God walks through the blood by himself. Abram never lifts a foot to join him. He never has to prove his side of the bargain, because in this covenant, both halves of the sacred promise rest completely on God alone. This covenant will produce Isaac, Jacob, and eventually a nation of slaves in Egypt. 400 years later, those slaves have no idea that an old promise made in a deep sleep is the only reason they are about to be free. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing centuries later, treated this scene not as legend but as recorded history. It was a real ceremony between a real man and the living God who had called him directly out of Ur. That nation's name is Israel. Their deliverer is a man named Moses. At 80 years old, this former prince of Egypt turned shepherd stands at the base of a mountain that is on fire without burning, pouring out thick smoke. God has just brought 2 million people completely out of slavery through a sea that should have drowned them. Behind Moses stand former slaves who recently had nothing to their name but chains and cruel taskmasters. Now they stand at the foot of a mountain, shaking under the weight of God's presence. They are about to be told that the God who freed them wants something even bigger than freedom. He wants a relationship sealed in blood. At the foot of that smoking mountain, he gives them his law and seals it the same ancient way. Moses takes the blood of the sacrifice and splits it in two. Half goes on the altar, representing God's side of the covenant. He sprinkles the other half directly onto the people standing in front of him. Their robes are spattered red, as he says words that will echo forever. Behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you. This was not a contract on parchment, it was blood on skin. You have to understand what this felt like while standing in that crowd. The blood is still warm, and the smoke from the mountain has not cleared at all. The ground beneath your sandals is still trembling from what happened on the summit. You are being told that the God who split a sea to save your life is now bound to you by something you can never casually walk away from. Centuries later, Jewish rabbis writing in the Babylonian Talmud would still wrestle with that single afternoon. They debated what it meant for an entire nation to be married, in blood, to an invisible God on a mountain. That is how seriously this historical moment was taken. It was not folklore passed down for simple entertainment. It stood as the single most binding legal and spiritual event in the entire history of that nation. Pay attention to this detail because it changes everything. The same word berith, used for Noah's rainbow and Abraham's silent walk through blood, is the exact word Moses uses here at Sinai. It is the same sacred cost. The people standing at the base of that mountain have no idea that this is only the third chapter in a grand story. This narrative is about to get a whole lot bigger, and it is going to become a lot more personal. Let us pause here for a second, because a clear pattern has emerged that most people read past without ever noticing. Noah had blood on an altar and a rainbow. Abraham had blood between pieces and a very deep sleep. Moses had blood on an altar, and blood sprinkled on the people themselves. Every single time God makes a promise to a human being in the Bible, something has to die first. This death provides a powerful guarantee. Not because God enjoys death, but because a promise this serious between a perfect God and imperfect people needs a strong guarantee. It must be strong enough to survive the absolute worst thing humans do: break their word. If this is the first time you are seeing the covenants laid out this way, side by side like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, hit subscribe now. We are only at the third covenant, and the next two are unexpected. Drop a comment with the name of the character you find most fascinating so far: Noah, Abraham, or Moses. Let us keep going, because what comes next changes everything about how you read the rest of this entire story. The blood does not just seal the promise, it points forward every single time. Centuries after Moses sprinkles blood at Sinai, a shepherd boy from Bethlehem becomes a king. His name is David, and he is no longer young. David has fought intense wars, buried close friends, and made major mistakes that will follow him for the rest of his life. These are choices you and I recognize immediately, because his failures look just like ours. One night, sitting in a palace he built himself, David has a thought that seems harmless enough on the surface. He wants to build God a house. It makes sense because David has cedar walls while God lives in a tent. David wants to fix what feels like an embarrassing imbalance. He spent years fighting giants, hiding in caves from men who wanted him dead, and finally sitting on a royal throne he honestly never expected to reach. Now that he has comfort, he wants to give some of it back to the God who got him there. But that night, a prophet named Nathan comes to David with a message, and this message flips the entire idea right on its head. God does not want David to build him a house. Instead, God is going to build David one. It is not a building but a lasting dynasty. God tells him that his house and his kingdom shall be made sure completely forever. God promises his throne shall be established forever. Think about what that means. Every leader before David was temporary. Death ended their authority the very same day it ended their heartbeat. But this is different. God is telling a flawed, blood-stained shepherd turned king that his throne will outlast massive empires that have not even been born yet. Here's the part nobody tells you. David's own family will betray this promise. His son Solomon will marry foreign wives and build altars to foreign gods. The kingdom will split in two. Within a few hundred years, the throne of David will fall completely as Babylon burns Jerusalem to the ground. David's descendants will be marched into exile in chains. By every visible measure, the covenant looked like a broken promise lying in the dust. If you have watched a promise fall apart, you know how that exile felt. Imagine walking for weeks under guard, away from the only city you have ever called home, away from a temple reduced to scorched stone. You carry nothing but the clothes on your back and a promise that looks like a failure. The historian Josephus describes the scale of that destruction in detail. Entire neighborhoods were burned, the treasury was emptied, and a once proud city was left as little more than rubble, ash, and complete ruin. You would have had every reason to believe God's word to David was just a fictional story old men told their grandchildren. That is exactly the deep despair this next part of the ancient story is directly written into. But the Hebrew word here is chesed, which means a covenant loyalty so stubborn it survives the failure of the person it was made with. Chesed is not love that gives up easily when you let the other side down. Chesed is love that keeps showing up long after most relationships would have quietly ended. In the middle of national heartbreak, while Israel is sitting in exile, a prophet named Jeremiah says something impossible. He says God is going to make a brand new covenant. This is not a repaired version of the old one, nor is it a temporary patch. It is a new one entirely. God says he will write his law directly on their human hearts. This law is not on stone, nor on a scroll locked in a temple that Babylon burned to ashes. It is on the heart, on the inside of a person, where no invading army can ever march in and completely destroy it. It is on the inside of you, especially if you have ever felt like your good intentions kept failing when life got hard. Every covenant before this had been written on something external like stone, a scroll, or the sky. This new covenant would be written somewhere no enemy could ever reach again. Now watch what happens next, because 5 different covenants made across 2,000 years of history start to converge into one shape. Noah's covenant required blood and promised survival. Abraham's required blood and a nation. Moses' covenant required blood and a relationship. David's covenant promised an eternal throne for his descendants. Jeremiah's prophecy promises something even bigger than all of it combined. It is a covenant so deep it does not just cover a nation's actions, it completely rewrites the human heart from the very inside. 5 covenants form one thread and one promise, getting closer to the human heart with every passing generation until it finally arrives at yours. There is one more thing you need to know before it all comes together. For several hundred years after Jeremiah speaks, nothing happens. The temple is rebuilt, and people return from exile as generations pass. The promise of a new covenant sits quietly in the background of Jewish history. It sits like a debt nobody has collected on yet. Until one night, in an upper room in Jerusalem, a Jewish carpenter's son sits down for a meal with 12 close friends and suddenly lifts a sacred cup of wine. He does not lift it like a man proposing a simple toast. He lifts it like a man about to cut a covenant. Jesus says, "This cup is the new covenant in his blood, which is poured out for you," to 12 completely unaware men. Stop and sit with that sentence for a moment. He does not say this cup represents or symbolizes a new agreement. He explicitly says this cup is the new covenant, the exact same promise that Jeremiah spoke about. This is the covenant that would be written not on stone but on the human heart. He says it will be sealed the same way every covenant before it was sealed. It will be sealed in blood, and that blood is his very own. The Greek word here is diatheke, and it carries a double weight you need to understand. It means covenant, but it also means testament, which is the kind of binding legal document a dying man writes for his estate. Jesus is not simply making a promise. He is writing a will and naming every person who would ever trust him as an heir to everything in it. The only way a will like this takes effect is if the author actually dies. Imagine the confusion around that table. These men walked dusty roads with Jesus for 3 years. They watched him heal the blind, calm storms, and raise the dead. Now he says he is about to become the sacrifice himself. You can feel the silence settle over that room as the weight of his words sinks in. A fisherman named Peter insists he would die before letting that happen, but within hours, fear will cause him to deny knowing Jesus. The gospel writers did not have to include this embarrassing detail, except that it happened, and they were completely determined to tell the absolute truth. The very next day, that is exactly what takes place. Soldiers come for him in a garden at night while his closest friends sleep nearby, too exhausted by grief to keep watch. He is beaten, mocked, and nailed to a brutal Roman cross on a hill right outside Jerusalem. The crowd includes people who days earlier laid palm branches in his path and called him a king. Now they call for his death. At this worst moment in human history, the open loop from the very beginning finally closes. Remember Abraham and the deep sleep. Remember the smoking firepot and blazing torch that passed alone between the pieces of sacrifice, while Abraham never lifted a foot or had to prove his side of the heavy agreement. This image was never just a strange historical detail. It was a preview written 400 years before Moses, 1,400 years before David, and almost 2,000 years before the cross was established. The church father Augustine looked back across every covenant and reached the same conclusion. He argued that none of those earlier covenants, from Noah to David, were ever meant to stand completely on their own. Each covenant was a shadow and a rehearsal, Every single one was pointing toward one final, complete covenant that would be sealed in blood exactly once, by someone who would never need the promise to be renewed again. On that hill outside Jerusalem, God walks through the covenant alone again. This time it is not a fire pot or a torch passing between pieces. It is the Son of God himself, nailed to wood, taking the curse on his own body. He took the curse that should have fallen on every person who ever broke a promise to him, which is every single person who has ever lived, including you. This is not a story about a list of covenants to memorize. This is not a story about ancient blood rituals with no relevance to your actual life, nor is it about a system designed to keep you anxious. It is a story about a God who chose to take the heavy punishment himself. Every single time his people failed to keep their side of the promise, he took the penalty rather than let the relationship die. Think about a parent for a moment and the instinct that rises when a child is in danger. Think of the desperate, immediate desire to take the pain instead, to stand between your child and whatever is coming, even if it costs everything. That instinct is not learned. It is planted deep within the human heart. Most people feel it the moment they hold their own child for the first time, even if they have never read theology. You do not have to be religious to recognize it. You only have to have loved someone deeply enough. You only have to wish, just once, that you could carry their pain instead of them. Now multiply that instinct by infinity, and you start to understand the cross. Abraham fell asleep and never walked through the blood. On that hill, God did not send someone else to take humanity's place. He did not ask Abraham, Moses, or David to bear the curse meant for promise breakers. He stepped into the gap himself in the body of his own son. He walked through the fire that should have consumed every single one of us. He did not delegate the suffering. Instead, he completely absorbed it. The historian Josephus confirmed that a man named Jesus was executed. He was executed under the authority of Pontius Pilate. This detail anchors the story in real recorded history, not legend. This did not happen in a myth. It happened on a real hill in front of real historical witnesses. You can visit the region today and read Roman records. They confirm a governor named Pilate actually held that office in that province at the exact time the Gospels say he did. 3 days later, the testament took effect. A testament only has power after the author dies, but Jesus did not stay dead. The tomb was completely empty. Roman soldiers trained to guard against escape had no explanation that could satisfy anyone who looked. The new covenant Jeremiah promised, written on the human heart, was no longer a prophecy. It was real history. It was no longer something that happened only to frightened men in an upper room. It is offered to you. Here is what all 5 covenants leave you with. 3 key takeaways and 1 question worth sitting with long after this video ends. Takeaway 1 is that every single covenant in the Bible strictly required blood. A promise from a holy God to broken people must be sealed with something strong enough to survive human failure. That is not a side detail in Scripture. It is the entire architecture of it from the first page to the last. Every story about the Bible's heroes is one continuous narrative about a promise that refused to die, no matter how many times people let it slip. From Genesis to Revelation, it is one thread never broken by God. Takeaway 2 is that you are not on the outside of this story, watching it happen to ancient people who died thousands of years ago. The new covenant was made for you specifically, not just for a nation in general. This is for the person watching this right now who knows exactly how many promises they have broken in their own life and is still wondering if that completely disqualifies them from this grand story. It does not. Takeaway 3 is the one I want you to actually sit with. Abraham fell asleep, and God walked through the blood alone, so that a man named Abraham would not have to face the terrifying curse of a broken agreement. 2,000 years later, on a hill outside Jerusalem, God walked through it alone again. Except this time, he didn't send a torch or a firepot to stand in for him. He sent his own son. He took the curse meant for you. He took the curse meant for you so that you would never have to walk through it yourself. That's not religion. That's a father who would rather suffer than lose you. Which covenant in this video hit you the absolute hardest? Was it Noah's rainbow, Abraham's silent sleep, or the cross itself? Tell me below, because I read every single comment, and I want to know which part of this story is sitting with you right now. For 2,000 years, people have cut covenants in blood, on altars, between the pieces of dead animals, trying to guarantee a promise too important to break. Every one of those covenants pointed toward a single afternoon. Every one of those covenants pointed toward a single afternoon on a hill outside Jerusalem. God only needed to do it once, and he did it himself, so that you would never have to walk through the fire alone.